Great, no sound. Great, no sound. All right, I'm back. I see you. You can't hear me. Let's begin. Let's just have a little silent talk at the camera. Take time out. Let's start again. All righty, from the top. Let's go. So, they throw me now. So, I've got 200 people watching live, and I had no sound. So, first of all, okay, this episode. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast. We'll cut that piece out. Why do people comply? Is the title of tonight's episode, following a fantastic interview with Professor Mattias Desmet earlier in this week. Who featured on the podcast on Tuesday, where we discussed why people comply or why people buy into the mainstream narrative. And he really gave some fascinating insights into the reasons why not only people buy into these narratives, but what makes people more susceptible to buying into these narratives. And then how those narratives are the precondition, and some of the elements surrounding those narratives are the precondition for authoritarianism. Really fascinating interview. I strongly recommend you check that out if you haven't seen that earlier this week. It's already had something like 20,000 views now on YouTube alone. So to follow that, I want to answer the question, why do people comply? And this is off the back of not only the interview with Professor Desmet earlier this week, but someone asked me the question yesterday, do I believe that the vaccine rollout will stave off lockdowns this winter? Now, I think they were trying to stimulate a debate about the efficacy of the vaccines and the prospects of COVID. I shared yesterday kind of a recap, the state of the nation in last night's broadcast. And I think I surprised them somewhat with my answer. Although if they're a regular viewer of the show, it shouldn't come as any surprise. But I said it's not the vaccines that will determine whether we go into lockdown this winter. It's whether the public will comply with the mandates that are brought forth. Because ultimately, in a situation that we're facing right now, it's really the public compliance that enables these guidelines or mandates or restrictions to be enacted. It's important for the public always to remember that it is the power is held in the public's hand, and it's delegated to the governments to act in their best interests. Now, what we've seen over the last 18 months, I can't believe the conversation around lockdowns is coming around again. Of course it is. It's winter. And we haven't learned from the lessons that have clearly been demonstrated, as I pointed out quite clearly in yesterday's broadcast. And if you haven't seen the lockdown summit that was recorded in July, you can go to questioneverything.io and check out all of the evidence around why lockdowns are a terrible idea and have been deeply ineffective. But my answer, as I said, was it's not the vaccine rollout or COVID itself that will determine whether we have lockdowns. It's whether the public will comply. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about 10 reasons why people comply. And I'll be dropping some hints around how public obedience not only supports government policy, but what a nonviolent movement can do to uncouple some of that compliance, which is critical, really, because as we from Tuesday's episode with Professor Desmet, that typically you'll get around 30% of the population eventually rejecting or rebelling against certain rules and regulations. But then there's a 40% who are kind of silently complicit with or silently comply with the rules. And some of them, or even a high proportion of them, may be dissatisfied, but nonetheless, they still are obedient. And this episode will really, to follow on from the conversation on Tuesday, will kind of give you some ideas about why people comply. And to pretext this, or to pre-frame this, there are, of course, many good rules and regulations out there that deserve compliance because they are for the genuine interests of the individual or society that they seek to benefit. So, compliance in itself is not a fundamentally flawed concept. As rebellious as one may feel, there are certain rules and things that do act in our interests, but there are certainly lots of others, particularly when they are set by the science, i.e., whenever I hear the narrative, that are much more subjective, and many of the rules and regulations and guidelines and laws that we've seen over the last 18 months are certainly subjective. So tonight's episode is really to answer the question, why do people comply, giving you 10 reasons why. So reason number one, I should have done a PowerPoint for this because it is literally 10 points. Habit, because since childhood, most people have essentially been educated and conditioned to obey authority. Not just obey authority, and again, authority can come in any form. When you're a child, your nearest source of authority is your parents, and then your teachers, and it's ingrained in us to obey. So it's a habit. It's a habit to obey. This process does begin with our parents and our grandparents, and in our school and our teachers. These are figures of authority that we obey, as are for those people who follow in certain career paths, the management structures. If you go into the military, for instance, the superiors are the ones that people obey. In the workplace, we'll have managers and bosses, etc. And it's normalized that we obey authority. It becomes a habit. What's interesting is we also obey symbols of authority. And again, not all of these are contentious, but our habits range from respecting, certainly in the UK, if you go to a bar or a restaurant or public transport, you'll see the no smoking sign, and you don't smoke in those areas. It's a form of obeying not just the rules, but the symbols of authority, or traffic lights or stop signs in the road, etc. And this has been shown. People will still obey authority around stop signs, etc., even if they're in the middle of a deserted road, in the middle of nowhere. People will still do those things because they've kind of been trained. It's become a habit. Now, breaking the obedience habit is a difficult task, just like quitting smoking. Both the decision to stop obeying and the reasons why it's important to stop obeying are constantly required. Because if you think about it, using that piece around symbolism, over the last 18 months, there's been lots of graphical representations of the rules and guidelines. We've seen the stickers and the lines and the circles in the floor, to keep you socially distanced. You see the government posters. You hear it on the radio. I don't really listen to the radio, but when we had workmen in the house, they had the radio on full blast, and every break just adverts with the government's mantras. I forget, face, space, or something or other. I can't remember. I deliberately didn't allow myself to be indoctrinated by that propaganda. But in order to break that pattern of compliance, it's really important that people are brought to a point of leverage where they feel like enough is enough. And then that reinforcement of the reason why, because habits die hard. So the form of habit of compliance in itself is a reason why people comply. So that's number one. Number two is self-interest. Although many people may intensely dislike what the government or the politicians are doing, some will still actively support them because they actually benefit from the situation, which therefore provides an incentive for them to obey. I've joked about it several times on this podcast, but where I was living during the first lockdown, quite a nice part of town here in Bristol, there were plenty of people sat in the sun enjoying champagne and alcoholic beverages in the daytime, just kicking back, getting paid to have time off work. I think during the first lockdown, many people enjoyed their little time off work in the sun, an extended paid holiday, and therefore ignored the fact that their liberties had been significantly curtailed and they're only allowed out the house to shop and exercise for an hour a day. Quite bizarre. But quite clearly, people financially benefited from the lockdowns, individuals, families, but also big business. There's a lot of big businesses that have made and industries that have made a lot of money from this situation, which perpetuates the situation we find ourselves in. So the reality is, people will comply until it hits them in their backyard, or they feel it personally, metaphorically. So self-interest is a big driver of compliance. Number three is the fear of consequences. Now, a strong reason why people obey the rules is fear of punishment. Violation of a law or a rule can result in a variety of consequences, from fines to jail time or losing your job, your position, or worse. And people fear the criminal record. If you go to a protest, they don't want to get arrested because, therefore it could impact upon other areas of their life. So the most powerful function of sanctions that come with these rules and regulations is the fear that they produce in people. And this fear of breaking the rules keep people obedient. And interestingly, it's not just the fear of the consequences, it's the fear of what other people may think if they break the rules, which I'll come on to. So that's the fear of the consequences of breaking the rules and guidelines and laws. Number four is indifference or apathy. Many people simply obey because of the cost of not doing so. Seems at that moment to be more trouble than it's worth. People are deeply apathetic. That people consider themselves to be apolitical, and they don't want to get involved in stirring, moving the apple, moving the status quo along. However, the reality is, when laws are passed that restrict basic rights and freedom, when they finally intrude upon that zone of indifference or apathy, people then may become motivated to act. So one of the keys to developing a successful movement is to find ways to show the public that indifference or apathy actually contributes to the oppression and the erosion of civil liberties. The problem here is, the major obstacle is that those who are typically apathetic are also very prone to the government's propaganda. So actually, to get someone to move off that point of indifference or apathy is incredibly hard, unless, as I mentioned, it really hits them personally, and therefore they may feel moved to act or speak out. So number four is indifference or apathy. Number five is the absence of self-confidence. Now, people may feel disillusioned with the status quo or the rules and the guidelines, but they may lack self-confidence in their own ability to actually stand up or step up or have the courage to speak out. And generally, this extends from a multitude of reasons, but it can often come from a lack of opportunity, where people have not had the opportunity to develop personal leadership or situations where they feel courageous to go against the grain. Therefore, a key factor in a successful movement is to actually empower people so that they do feel courageous, not only to speak out, but also to take effective action that can bring about positive change. It's important, again, to remind the public that the political power is held with the people. And therefore, in situations like that, they can take it back. So that lack of self-confidence, the lack of courage to speak out is a big reason why people comply. So it's easier for them. The pain of speaking out becomes greater than the pain of the situation they find themselves in. So it's the fifth reason for compliance. Number six is a big one in the context of what we're looking at here. Moral obligation, or this idea of the common good of society, coming from the assumption, whether those are flawed assumptions or not, that the laws and guidelines are there to protect the citizens. We've heard this throughout the pandemic. It's to protect others, even if it makes no sense. People feel a moral obligation to obey even the most hated politicians. And a lot of people, I find, during the last 18 months, particularly those on the left side of politics, have an almost vitriolic sentiment towards the incumbent government and Boris Johnson. Yet, despite that hatred for the politicians, they still want to maintain order and feel like they're doing their bit for the greater good. And laws are, this idea that laws are made for people to respect them. However, it's our job to point out subtly that, or overtly, that sometimes laws are not legitimate and they do not protect society. And sometimes it therefore becomes a moral obligation to disobey the laws and to become non-compliant and to engage in civil disobedience. So the moral obligation is a very subjective one, and we've seen very cleverly that moral good has been attached to many different policies, from lockdowns to vaccinations over the last 18 months, dangerously so, given the harms that have followed. So in this case, it's important to show people that sometimes it's the moral obligation to disobey. Number 7, the psychological identification with the party or the politician. Yes, like football fans or sports fans, sometimes people feel a certain level of loyalty to the party or the leader that they've previously bought into. You know, if you're in the UK, in this case, if you're a long-standing Conservative or long-standing peculiarly fan of Boris Johnson, I don't know how that would happen, but it apparently it's a thing. Then people would feel a certain loyalty to the party and therefore toe the party line. This is a particular problem with the politicians themselves, obviously following the party whip. So compliance and following whatever the government mandates or information is almost inevitable. However, again, the movement it can emphasize that although the ruler or the party may in some way try to project that they represent the interests of the people that they've previously ruled, in actuality, they no longer have the best interests in mind. And you know, I had some fascinating conversations over the last 2 days for people from both the left and the right side of politics. Traditionally, you know, the left and the right is scrambled and jumbled right now, but and very limiting. But fascinating to see how both people on the left and the right feel like the current situation does not actually meet their values and preferences politically. So this is a real opportunity, but it needs people to break their psychological identification with the party that they've previously supported, or even the politicians on a local level. Some people have a deep connection with their local MP. I definitely don't. Nice enough guy, but we definitely don't see eye to eye. So the psychological identification with the party, the politician itself, is a problem. Now, number 8, similarly to the first point that I made around habits, is the deference to authority. Now, deference, in other words, is submission or passivity. It's the condition of submitting to the espoused authority of one's superior or superiors, and people tend to yield to what the experts, and we're in this real technocratic time where the science again comes up, because people have deference to this or submission to this judgment of this recognized expert or superior out of respect or almost reverence, which we've seen, and in which case the act of disobeying this authority is almost deemed a form of sacrilege, which is just quite peculiar that these sage advisors, these scientists, this bleak group of people that have been steering the pandemic response have almost been given godlike power and respect, this almost superhuman perception, which just totally blows my mind. But there's been a lot written on the deference of authority and the psychology of compliance around that. But that's a key component of why people comply. That's number 8. Number 9 is a sense of helplessness or hopelessness, not necessarily on a personal level this time, when I talked about previously point 5 around the absence of self-confidence, but in this case, hopelessness that after seeing the efforts of the resistance, perhaps people protesting on the streets over and over again and not necessarily seeing any major progress, they come to a point where they believe that things cannot change and they feel disempowered and that there's no hope for the future. And in this case, again, the movement's responsibility is to build people's confidence through repeat action, but also to demonstrate the small wins, because a protest movement is only successful over time when those small wins stack and stack and stack, and those individual victories lead to larger victories in the future. We live in this kind of convenience, instant gratification culture where we expect things to happen yesterday. The reality is nothing great was ever done overnight. There is no such thing as an overnight hero, and in this particular predicament, it takes time to create change. And the last one is the majority are doing it. Now, this is again down to peer pressure and social conditioning, social proof, because people fear this has a powerful influence on human behavior, because people don't want to go against the grain or go against the crowd. If most people are doing something, it's seen. It's seen they don't want to stand out from the crowd. And if the majority of the people are behaving a certain way, they don't want to go against that. There's this need for social proof and social validation. People are afraid what their friends and family might think if they stand up. However, if the majority of people start to behave differently, these people may also start to behave differently as well. So that's the importance of protesting, is when you see hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people in the street standing up for a cause, you recognize that actually it's not the majority necessarily seeing the world or acting in a certain way. So that's the importance of protests. Now, I have a lot to say on this matter around how we can actually influence others. The most important thing I've ever learned about influence is that in order to influence other people, you must first discover what already influences them. So what is leading someone to comply? It could be one of these 10 things, but it's different for every individual. But ultimately, as Mattias said earlier this week, it's really important that we continue to speak out. And those who do have the courage to step out and speak out and act out through non-compliance, it creates a ripple effect that can become a wave. Now, I will close by saying, there's lots of different ideas around the importance of a protest movement. It's part of raising awareness of issues. It's not necessarily the vehicle for change itself. But you must be aware now that there is a protest in London this Saturday. I think there's several others as well. I'm supportive of any peaceful action that takes affirmative action against the government overreach that we've experienced in the last 18 months, put bluntly. But I will be in London with the Pandemic Podcast team on Saturday to broadcast about the event and participate in the events that take place in London this weekend. So really, this is your opportunity to step up and speak out. So if you've never been to the protest before, have the courage to do so, knowing that you'll be joined by hundreds of thousands of people, like-minded people who are similarly standing up against these issues. And if that's not right for you, then you can see the Together Declaration banner behind me. You can take a small action by simply signing that declaration to stand against one of the aspects that we're campaigning against, the vaccine passports. But I do hope that we will see many of you in London this weekend. Do come and say hello. Do come and say hi. I really do enjoy meeting face to face. I don't get to see my face on the screen. I just see your names in the comments. But it'd be great to see you in person. So if you're out in force with us in London on Saturday, do come and see us. The Together team are also going to be out giving out T-shirts and placards. So do look out for that at Hyde Park. I think that's the meeting point for the public demonstration. So look forward to seeing some of you at the weekend. And I'll be back again tomorrow for our final episode of the week. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already seen the episodes from earlier this week, Rainer Fulnick on Monday, and then Professor Mattias Desmet on Tuesday. And then yesterday, I gave a State of the Nation recap of where the current situation currently lies and where it could potentially go. So the last thing I'll say to you, if you haven't already subscribed to the Pandemic Podcast and joined thousands of other people who are supporters of the show, please just take one moment of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. To register for our mailing list so I can keep you firmly up to date with any content and campaigns that we're involved in. So thank you once again for tuning in tonight and sharing this episode where we discuss the 10 reasons why people comply with some subtle hints about how we can break that spell of compliance. I'll see you once again tomorrow and hope to see several of you in London at the weekend. Good night for now.